the 21st. And then on the 23rd, we have 3 technical sessions on 21st. And then we have on the 23rd is the major launch of the UNESCO HUL call for action. And we plan a high-level session that day with mayors and several high-level representatives. The Assistant Director General for Culture will be chairing that session. And then on Friday, the 24th, we have the implementation of HUL in World Heritage Cities. As you know, there are more than 313 World Heritage Cities, and so this would be a way to bring all the learning and the synthesis of these technical sessions to the 24th, and there'll be roundtable discussions there. So with that, I just want to give a very short introduction to the whole recommendation. I think all of you are already quite familiar with it, but just in case there are some who are not, I will give a very short recommendation, a very short introduction. There is a question in the chat about the interpretation, and indeed there is English and Spanish interpretation that is available. Please select the button at the bottom to choose that. And I would like to request also, while I have the microphone, that everybody keeps their microphone switched off when not speaking. Thank you very much. So next slide, please. So the whole recommendation was adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO in 2011, November. We consider it a soft law to be implemented by the member states on a voluntary basis, and as an additional tool to integrate policies and practices of conservation of the built environment into the wider goals of the urban development with respect to inherited values and traditions of different cultural contexts. It applies to all historic cities, not only to World Heritage sites. And it advocates a landscape approach for identifying, conserving, and managing historic areas within their broader context, considering the interrelationship between physical form, natural features, and social and cultural values. The HUL recommendation emphasizes an approach that views the historic center or ensemble, recognizing it as an intricate part of the larger setting. So in a sense, it advocates looking at historic urban areas as composed of layers of history, economic, and spatial social relationships between the built, heritage, natural environment, and the local communities. Next, please. The International Experts Meeting Heritage in Urban Context in 2020 in Fukuoka led to that really focused on the worrying pattern of situations affecting heritage sites in urban context, and as requested by the World Heritage Committee, reflected on some ways forward. And the main outputs was a methodology to better identify urban attributes for heritage and a basic framework for urban heritage management that was developed and refined the previously developed 6-step approach for implementing the whole recommendation. Next, please. So I just want to close by showing 2 small slides introducing you to the work that the World Heritage Cities is doing, in case you're not already on board with us, which is on the World Heritage Cities as well as on the HUL recommendation. We have, first of all, there's more than 313 cities which are on the World Heritage in the World Heritage Program. And then there's the HUL recommendation, which looks at the theoretical and methodological approaches and looks at developing guidance in that regard. I hope that all of you are subscribed to Urban Notebooks, which is the monthly e-newsletter on urban heritage conservation and management that we are putting out in English, French, and Spanish. If you have not already subscribed to it, you could just go to the World Heritage Cities website and subscribe to it, and you can see the city's website here. And I'm sure that my colleagues can also put it on the chat. And then finally, we have the Canopy, which is the World Heritage-based solutions, or heritage-based solutions for sustainable futures, which is a platform for good practices, or you might say innovative strategies, and ways to integrate the HUL recommendation with sustainable development. So with that, I want to stop here. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I want to turn over the session to the able chairmanship of Mr. Eduardo Roja. We are very delighted to have you with us. As you know very well, Mr. Roja is very well known for his work on heritage conservation, and is an architect and planner, and currently a lecturer at the Whitman School of Design in the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to also take this chance to introduce our rapporteur for this session, who has a very important role to play, because it's not only today that she will be capturing the key points of all of the presentations, but bringing them to us also on the 24th to report on this session. And we are very delighted to have with us Ms. Maya Ishizawa, Heritage Specialist and member of ICOMOS IFLA, International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscapes. And with this, I hand over to Mr. Eduardo Roja. Please, Eduardo.
Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a great honor for me to be here with you today and to take part in this celebration. So thank you for being with us. And my first thanks have to go to UNESCO for enabling me to take on the role of moderating the session. I don't want to take too much time because we're all anxious to hear about these case studies. So really, I just wanted to make one remark, some very short remarks. Could we have the next slide, please? Because I do think that the recommendation actually was a turning point in 2011 around the world and in Latin America too. Essentially, there was a change in the focus when it came to the physical urban fabric of heritage, because it really did take into consideration all of the different strata in urban behavior, urban fixtures, the way people live, and this had to dovetail with heritage. And it's true that this is not actually something that we're unfamiliar with when it comes to urban planning. And so there was this intersection between the ideas of heritage conservation on the one hand and sustainable development of cities on the other. And the very essence of this notion of historic urban landscape is actually in this interaction between the two. And so I think here the two were connected. There was this theoretical framework that actually was able to be a tool for guiding the practical witness. And so there was this consensual understanding of how the recommendation needed to be rolled out. And when we look at the methodologies they used, it's essentially about building consensus. And you have to assess the different vulnerabilities. And all of these are very important aspects, because there's not only the canonical understanding of what heritage is. We've also got to make sure that that this fits with the way urban centers work. And so there was a huge impact from an analytical perspective, and academic analysts were able to have a huge impact. And I personally was in touch with the municipality of Cuenca, and we were able to discuss the different concepts in play. The interpreter apologizes, the sound is breaking up. And so I think that this is why now we're starting to see such a big impact in historic urban landscapes. And yet we are still at the very outset of the final impact that this recommendation could have, the potential impact. And that's why it's important to mention this right at the start of our proceedings. And the issue of management, remember, lots of cities are actually quite advanced in this. If we took an example, if you look at Quito in Ecuador or Cuenca, they're actually quite advanced in this. And there are other Latin American cities around my region where they're quite advanced in this, in having an integrated approach to management so that any changes in the city are actually managed. Next slide, please. The issue is that we've really got to try to strike a balance in which all of the different stakeholders, be they developers, be they financiers or the beneficiaries, all of them have to coincide in making sure that the urban heritage in question is protected, funded, and promoted or developed in a way that suits everyone. In other words, all of the different stakeholders have to be taken into consideration in the equation. And remember, when we talk about stakeholders, it's very broad. It's absolutely every single category of person involved. And so they've all got their different interests. And we have to if you're talking about a particular project to build a tall building, for example, there are those who are funding it, who want to see it happen. There are those who are developing it. There are those who have a lot to gain from it. All of those interests have to be taken into consideration. They say, well, if I can get the benefit out of this. And so all of those potentially conflicting interests have to be taken into consideration. So to have a truly holistic approach to management means listening to all of those stakeholders. And what we really have to achieve is to ensure that all of these different social categories are working in a coordinated, consistent, dedicated manner. In other words, they've all got to be dedicated to that vision of management. And the idea is that this is going to be very difficult, but it can be possible if all of those different interests, be it about the fixtures, the buildings, the spaces, are all built into one vertical concept. In Latin America, we've got many institutions which, for one reason or another, only when they look at their historical urban areas, they tend to have a monofocus. But it's absolutely crucial that we need to ensure that those who are in charge of the development plans and the resources and all of the consent, and the public sector, the private sector, are all on board. And then the identities at the local level, the municipal level, the regional level, all of those have to have their say. And now that we're listening to all of those, this means a major turning point, as I said, because the focus has changed. So in other words, not only talking about rules for protecting that are usually imposed top down from how to protect our built heritage. Suddenly, we're looking at all of the different, these different aspects. In other words, when you have to mainstream all of the different aspects of social, of an environmental, cultural, formal and informal economy, schooling, buildings, all of that has to be built into your urban planning. It seems very complex, and yet it means that it's easier to do if you're doing it at the local level, which means that instead of working at the regional level, these rules tend to be very, very localized. What's important to remember is that once you've set up the mechanism for coordinating all of this, the public, the private, the sector, and all the different stakeholders on board, once you've set forward what the objectives are for the development of this heritage city, first you have to look at how are we going to, what are the priorities, how are we going to invest in it, how are we going to fund the projects, and what are the different mechanisms that can come into play. Unfortunately, in Latin America, we don't actually have a lot of mechanisms available for that kind of project. So that is a challenge that we're working to overcome. And the trick is that what we're trying to achieve. Oh, I've done to my last minute, I'm told.
Yes.
Yes,
please.
my last minute.
Yes, please, because we are in a very tight schedule and we will have no more interpretation after 5 o'clock. So we really have to make sure to wrap everything up carefully. Thank you so much.
So we need to overcome these kinds of problems. Remember that instead of having top-down decisions, it's important that we're going to move towards a different process instead of being top-down imposed by the authorities. Next slide, please. And once we've got this great number of stakeholders and actors working in harmony towards a single heritage project, this is when it all comes together. And after years of experience, I can say it is a beautiful process. So what we really need to bear in mind, and you'll see this in the case studies that we're going to look at, is how much have we actually managed to do this? How far along are we in implementing these mechanisms, these governance mechanisms for HUL? And necessarily there'll be the need for some kind of reforms, be they legislative or regulatory, institutional, etc. And so that is what I wanted to share with you today as concerns my introduction for this meeting, and I'm interested in hearing about these case studies, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So maybe we could just move on to the next case study and have all the questions at the end, perhaps, for the discussion. That might be more efficient, I think, in terms of time, if that works for you, Eduardo. So I'll leave it in your good hands to manage the rest of the session.
Sí, hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Salva Zamarvide, yo trabajo para el programa de ciudades del Patrimonio Mundial en UNESCO.
Good afternoon. I work for the World Heritage Program in UNESCO, and I'll be giving the floor to the various speakers. The first speaker for this afternoon is the historical city of Puebla, report presented by the state government. Please carry on, sir. Mr. Calderon, and Secretary General of the Culture Area, you have the floor. We're going to be talking about the case of San Francisco in the city of Puebla. As you all know, city of Puebla is the fourth largest city in Mexico, territorial extension of some 534 square kilometers. It was founded in 1531 under Queen Isabel of Portugal, using a checkerboard pattern. It was declared by UNESCO in 1987 as a city that belonged to the World Heritage, and it was declared a historical city by the federal government in 1977. There are around 391 walks where there are many buildings with historical value and 2,619 buildings that have been considered by the National Institute as worthy of particular attention because of their historical value dating back to the 19th century. This is a part of the city that really grew tremendously, increased twofold, I would say, between 1960 and 1974. And in the year 1970, little by little, the city began to lose its population. At least the historical part of the city, not the outskirts, but in the city center, yes, became deteriorated in spite of the fact that it was of tremendous monumental value. And for the year 2000, the discrepancy was huge between the outskirts and the city center. The city center became practically empty of population due to all kinds of problems, particularly because it was tremendously expensive to live there and because there was not enough of a transportation grid available to the population. So the urban heritage, both tangible and intangible, is an essential thing in order to improve the habitability of these degraded urban areas and preserving the identity, obviously protecting also the historical value thereof. And the government of the state of Puebla has been doing everything it could to regenerate that monumental zone of the city through the San Francisco Management Plan, including all kinds of actions to be carried out both in the medium and in the long term. This will make it possible to try and find an answer to the various problems of facing the city at the present time. The tangible and intangible heritage in the hub of the city is absolutely essential to make that area habitable again. What we have is a program called San Francisco to integrate all of the various tools of management, of protection, rehabilitation, so as to make sure that we make headway both in the medium and in the long term, with medium and long-term objectives. Now, there are many buildings that have been abandoned because of socioeconomic problems. There's social tension also among the inhabitants because of the weakening of the social fabric. The whole of the urban image of the city has deteriorated, which means it's less attractive for tourism. And therefore, these are problems that must be absolutely coped with. For which purpose we need to develop integrated projects guaranteeing the preservation of the area, particularly in the hub part of the city known as San Francisco, guaranteeing that the action taken will actually be accepted the population to make it sustainable in the long run. To motivate the population, we've had all kinds of neighborhood participation workshops where we studied with the population all of the major issues concerning the lack of security, lack of communication among the inhabitants, not enough respect for the building code, inefficient public or street lighting, poor garbage collection, etc., etc. What we did was trying to, first of all, identify exactly what the problems were and how we could go about solving these problems area by area, sector by sector, developing the necessary public policies in order to make sure that public spaces would once again be enjoyed by the community at large, making sure that there could be some social and economic recovery. All kinds of different projects have been conceived to trigger private investment in what we know call what is known as the Paseo Viejo, in other words, the old path, or in the Toyac, in the Clinica area with low interest housing, in the El Alto Market, the Franciscan Museum, etc., etc. We've created a tremendous system to make it possible to attract more attention to the monumental zone of the city, making sure, obviously, not only that there is private, but also public investment. And so these are projects meant not just to trigger private investment, but also to attract public investment and to get the public authorities involved. For instance, a garden that is extremely well known at the parish of Santa Cruz that had been abandoned for a long time, but a lot is being done now to rehabilitate this area and to make it accessible to the public at large again. Making sure, obviously, that everything is done together with the population so as to develop a sense of ownership. The problem, as always, is getting the leadership involved. The lack of population in the area, as I told you, has been depopulated little by little, lack of security, the fact that the people living there, in fact, do show a certain degree of indifference, and therefore it's absolutely essential to get the community involved from the word go. Without communal participation, there's nothing can be done, really. Not in the long run. We must break down the barriers separating the various layers of the population. That is a must. And this project, therefore, wants to have a more inclusive, more integrated, more connected city, making sure that there's proper urban design and government and legislation and reviving the economy so as to make sure that there will be more links among the various inhabitants in all these neighborhoods, making sure there's greater security, greater acceptance on the part of the population, and that people could enjoy the same rights wherever they may live. I'm sorry, you're running out of time. Well, that was it. In fact, says the speaker, that was it. I've reached the end. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, says Dr. Rojas. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sergio Vergara, for your presentation. And now we have the municipality of Puebla. They're going to give us their own take on the management of the historical hub of the city from a different vantage point, from the public authority vantage point. So please carry on, sir. Floor is yours. Oh, Madam, good afternoon, all of you. Thank you very much for this invitation to take part in this 10th anniversary of the recommendation of UNESCO on whole. And I'll be talking about the initiative to protect the hub, historical hub of the city of Puebla. To give you some background, as you heard just now, the city of Puebla is 534 square kilometers and a population 1,692,000 inhabitants. It's the fourth most important city in Mexico, involving 39 municipalities, making up the larger metropolitan area of Puebla, Tlaxcala, where you find most of the economic, administrative, and public service institutions in the area. Among the important historical heritage is the center of the city itself, which was became part of the World Heritage of UNESCO in 1987. Total extension of 6 square kilometers, 2,619 buildings of tremendous historical value. The outstanding universal value and the conditions of integrity and authenticity are covered by Criterion 2, urban planning based on a Renaissance grid plan, and Criterion 4, civil and religious architecture, which is unique and presents a merger of the various architectural styles of Europe and America. And this is sui generis and therefore must be protected in order to enhance tourist development in the future. What are the challenges ahead of us? First of all, the fact that in the past, we really haven't had very good management reports, as shown by UNESCO in the 2 reports that they have carried out. It wasn't really well done. The strategy to conserve the city was really left a lot to be desired, because whenever there was a change in government, there was a change in practice, there was a change in approach, and therefore it's necessary to make sure that the three levels of government work with each other. Also, we need to have public and private investment really channeled in the best possible way and harmonize amongst them in order to protect not just the monumental part of things, but also to sustain the environment. And then the zone adjacent to the historical center is highly populated, it's very dense, and if this is not regulated well, urban growth is not regulated, it could be a threat in the future for the whole of the site and could even affect the life of the inhabitants. This is one of the things that we wanted to avoid, obviously, making sure that the outskirts of the adjacent areas to the historical centers are also brought into the management plan. So what we must do is to update the necessary standard setting instruments like the Municipal Program for Sustainable Development of Puebla, which is in this process of updating at the present time, and it will make it possible to see what the strategies, the best strategies are to have access to the center of the city and the protection of the urban and historical center, obviously always paying attention to sustainability of the environment and participation of the citizenry. In the light of this, in light of UNESCO recommendations on whole, we have defined a buffer area in order to protect the site. The purpose was to make sure that we will have gradual urban growth around the urban hub and to avoid deterioration of the landscape as called for by UNESCO and its World Heritage Convention. Also making sure that the built-up area around the site is protected, and making sure also that the degree of habitability is kept and not have any sort of wild construction of buildings mushrooming here and there and deteriorating the historical site. So what we're doing at the present time is making sure that all institutions work with each other to make sure that the buffer area is actually put together the way it should be, and the management plan also to develop the center of Puebla to make sure that the zone will be recognized through all the standard setting instruments in the municipality. We need the three levels of government involved, and also we need obviously private and public participation to the hilt, and communal participation as well, and to get this area recognized and to make sure that the physical transformation of the city won't affect the inhabitants and the adjacent areas. The buffer area is for 9 square kilometers, subdivided into various areas where we're going to have different guidelines also according, obviously, to the identity of each of them. All of that has to be kept into consideration, making sure that everything that is next to the cultural hub of the city, to the historical monumental site of the city, is adequately protected. There is a 200-meter strip all around the historical hub, so to make sure that there's a transition area between the very hub, the monumental zone, and the buffer zone. This will make it possible to protect the landscape and to avoid the mushrooming, as I said, of constructions which may deteriorate the site, and make sure obviously that we do the same as Mexico, Xochimilco or Oaxaca. They all have buffer areas. So Puebla needed its own buffer area. We found that this is a complete must if we wanted to protect the landscape. This buffer area has already been defined technically with all of the necessary regulations already in the pipeline coming from all the necessary authorities in the city of Puebla. However, to make sure that this actually gets off the ground, we need to make sure that the people participate. Those who are living there are going to be the major actors in this. There's nothing can be done without the participation of the people living in the buffer zone. This is why we organize workshops and all kinds of extension instruments to reach out to the people. Thanks to the implementation of this buffer area, it will be possible to transform or to manage the physical transformation of the city, making sure that whatever is done is in keeping with the guidelines that we must follow to protect the monuments, making sure that necessary regulations are implemented, not just in the historical area, but in the adjacent areas, bringing investment into the area, bringing tourism into the area as well. Stella, I'm very sorry, sorry to interrupt you, but you only have 1 minute left. Yes, but it's very important in keeping or in connection the need to protect the historical zone. You must take into consideration the necessary tools for planning and for standard setting instruments in spite of the changes in administration. This is tremendously important. This is an initiative that ties in with sustainable development in order to make sure that there's a gradual growth of the city, avoiding deterioration and making sure that everything moves forward smoothly. It is clear that this initiative is one among many. There's so very many things that we should be doing in order to protect the historical center. Implementing the UNESCO recommendation is first and foremost, and opening up paths of dialogue with the various stakeholders to make sure that we find a consensus and we find an equilibrium, a balance between tourism, protecting the city, economic recovery, the interest of the population, acceptance by the population. All of this must be found in a way, and this is the path to follow in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Graciela.
Thank you very much for sharing with us all that information about this marvelous city. And I'm looking forward to having a chance to chat with you more about that, because it really does seem like a fascinating project. Now we're moving towards Valparaíso, Chile. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss the case of Valparaíso. And I'm sorry that the mayor wasn't able to join us today, but I'm delighted to be able to present it in any case. So shall we continue with the presentation? Valparaíso is in Chile, in the central Pacific coast of Chile, which is 115 kilometers away from the capital, which is Santiago de Chile. And it's some just over 30,000 hectares, and only 20.4% of that is actually urban area. It's got nearly 300,000 inhabitants, and 94.7% of which live in the urban area. And the World Heritage Site actually corresponds to about 1%, just over 1% of that urban surface area. Next slide, please. It was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2003, and the historical area of the city was essentially because of its 19th century architecture, and it typifies this particular phase of globalization in the late 19th century. And because of its geographical and topographical shape, this amphitheater shape, the historical area has been able to bear testimony to the to this kind of vision of growth that people had at the time, including their funicular lines, their tram lines, electric transport systems, which were appropriate for the land, and which are still working today. When it comes to challenges and opportunities, well, the World Heritage Site is actually part of this amphitheater-shaped part of the city. Among the weaknesses identified, we saw that there's urban flight and a kind of neglect of some of the buildings, the poor quality of life. It's becoming less and less livable, and the high cost of renovating buildings. And on the other hand, we've got the densification in some of the outskirts of the cities and on the hillside part, which is actually less well connected. Another challenge is to obviously we want to get people to live once again in the historic center of the city, and yet we need to make sure that we have the resources for this, be they in terms of hotel, economic resources, and we're trying to find a way of repopulating the historic center. We met with the World Heritage Center and some of the decisions and missions. They were trying to make sure that the project dovetails perfectly with the recommendations. So we want to overcome the kinds of problems to do with neglect of the historic center. So this project is actually focused on the very center of this urban hub. And the building you can see there is a municipal building called the Tassara building. And just as we heard from Eduardo before, we're trying to bring on board the municipal institutions, but it was difficult to get the funding necessary to save this building and convert it into dwellings. In the case of Valparaíso, we did need if you want to have a municipal building and reconvert its use, then you need a whole series of regulations to be respected. So here we were looking at the historic use. Initially, it used to be basically a commercial platform, but when we look at the dwellings in the very historic center, the costs tend to be very high, and some of them are not so accessible. And so very often those who are living in the city don't have the means to go and live in the very center, and so there has to be a kind of rent subsidy. And yet if the different categories of usage of the buildings don't coincide, then it's going to be very difficult to be eligible for such rent subsidies. And so this is where the initiative comes into play. The idea was to coordinate these various different entities concerned with housing, and I do think the major achievement of this project was to bring together a range of different financial stakeholders, and still by focusing on cultural or tourist-based activities, we've been able to and to work towards working on the usage plan for these buildings. So the project didn't actually have open participatory processes, and yet what we were able to do was look at was maintain the ongoing use of these buildings. For example, in this building, there is a bar called the Liberty Bar, which is actually the oldest bar in the city of Valparaíso. And so the idea was to recover the use of the building, not only by making it accessible and economically viable for people, but to try to make sure that families would be eligible for the kinds of subsidies that could help them understand, not only enjoy living there, but also understand the contribution that building makes to the cultural fabric of the city. Yes, and we're running out of time. In the plaza, here you can see all of the different people and the kinds of events that are held in the plaza, particularly in this particular part of the city. Communities are starting to claim back their public spaces, and in this building, if you see on this slide, what we're looking at are the kind of structural systems of the building, and just make sure that they could actually withstand the new uses. And we realized that there was a structural issue that needed to be addressed, and so we needed to, with the bolstering of the building, and we looked at the different uses that would be made. We've got the commercial level of the building, and then and that needed bolstering, and then you've got the community part, because we realized that this particular neighborhood was missing a kind of community center, and so we wanted to make sure that there was a community space in this. So, in other words, all different uses of the building were taken into consideration. Over and above this, we were able to verify all of the costs and prices. it might actually seem to be that it would have been easy, but unfortunately, the image that we have in the amphitheater is that essentially something that's going to be affordable is going to be far away from the city. So people didn't actually have in mind that it could be possible to move back into the city, and yet we wanted to get to ensure that the center, the very hub of Valparaíso, could still be a vibrant place for people to live, and so this was why it was such an important project. And I think that I'm running out of time, but essentially we're trying to revive community life and create a model for investment, which will enable the public and private sector to work together for the common good and for the common public good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. It really does sound very interesting, and it shows us how the UNESCO concept is actually being put to good use. Now it's time to hear from Guanajuato in Mexico. Yes, and very good afternoon. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from the municipal house here in Guanajuato, more than 400 years, and it's one of the most ancient buildings in the city. We're in the center of Mexico, in a state which bears the same name, with a surface area of just over 1,000 square kilometers and 3.3% of the surface area of the state. And we've got nearly 200,000 people living here. The city of Guanajuato has a lot of folklore, color, flavors, customs, and the city has a very lively atmosphere. And at the same time, from ancient times, there have been many activities that built up around the mining industry in this town, which and including civil and religious festivals, and its wealth came from the mining activity. So it was basically founded by the Spanish in the 16th century and became one of the silver mining areas in the 16th and 17th century. And the architecture, the buildings are Baroque and neoclassical in style, and there's been a lot of history in this city. In the start of the Wars of Independence, this is when this was a site of some important battles, and the Compañía de Jesús and the Jesuit community was very involved. And in 1988, it was the people of the city itself which managed to put their efforts together and ensure the inscription on the World Heritage List of just over 2,000 hectares of surface area inscribed. It was inscribed under 4 different criteria on the World Heritage List. So there's being, for example, a masterpiece bearing testimony to the exchange of human values for a particular point in time, an outstanding example of architectural quality or an architectural ensemble, and being a place where traditions are maintained and so, all in all, part of its outstanding universal value of this city is that that both past and present, this city was able to be inscribed. Some of the key points of this were its architecture, but also its particular morphology because of the different local customs that give life to the city. So the architectural ensemble of the city means that it's been very good for tourism, which obviously has lots of prospects for economic, tourist, and social development. But some of the weakness of the site were the neglect of some of the buildings. And it's that neglect, I think, that has mean it's because people didn't actually have the awareness that they needed. And so they think it's all very wonderful having lots of tourists visit. And obviously this has suffered under the pandemic, as we all know. But more needs to be done to ensure that we can safeguard the historic center of the town. And so now this is why what is needed is to have a lot of conservation work and a sustainable management plan. And this is where the project comes in, because at the federal level, we had the World Heritage Directorate that was able to come up with this historic town of Guanajuato management plan. And it was in 2018 that the municipality came up with its management plan and created a management unit, which would be in charge of managing this cultural heritage. It started operations in 2020, but and there's a link that if you're going to be able to connect to it later, you'll see the this updated version of the management plan. And there's also a book, a kind of compendium of all of the different citizen initiatives that have been collated in one place through a competition that we ran. Now, with this management unit, what led to the creation of this management unit was that we realized there was no governing body overseeing management, and it was all up to local little municipal administrations. And so the idea was to ensure one harmonious management unit that could ensure a consistent management of the historic town of Guanajuato, and try to look at and ensure the different that the diversity of the city was taken into consideration.
What are the key components in this initiative? These are two major initiatives that are included in this particular presentation of mine. On the one hand, we have a contest called Redesign Your City. What is your ideal historical center? We open this wide to the whole of the population. Professionals, housewives, people of all ages, of all backgrounds, even children. We said, tell us what you think your historical center should look like. But let's not make a mistake about this. We're going to the citizenry. We're asking people, what do you think your city should look like? Well, that is precisely the kind of opinion we want, because we want to know that what we do in the future is actually backed up by the population. The University of Guanajuato is very active in this particular Redesign Your City contest. And the initiative, there's a second initiative, which is a neighborhood panel. The idea is to know exactly what the history and architecture of each particular neighborhood is like, so as to disseminate the artistic potential of each of these neighborhoods. We've lost the sound. We have no further sound. I'm sorry. We cannot hear the speaker. The speaker has muted himself, I think. We have lost the speaker. The results, the speaker's back on. This particular management unit got very good results through the lines of action we mentioned before. The contest, Redesign Your City, was very successful. 60 people, 60 contestants, professionals, students, public in general, joined this. The 5 best projects were chosen to be implemented later. And I must say that this is all in a book, which is available through the link that I showed you earlier. And the neighborhood panel, that was the second initiative, We've had 9 meetings so far of this particular panel. Again, we lost the voice of the speaker. We've had 11 reports presented, and we've had also virtual meetings with 210 higher education institutions throughout the country. So what was our takeaway from this? Well, the main conflict in launching the contest, Redesign Your City, and the historic neighborhood panel was the fact that we had to completely change strategies. We had to change our approach altogether. Because the way this kind of thing used to be done in the past had a very limited scope. What we wanted to do was to use the very latest technologies and use these technological tools as a way of eliciting attention of the population, particularly younger people who are more conversant with this type of technology. And so that people who may be interested in disseminating their ideas today and in the future can come and join us and use our platforms. Carlos, I'm sorry, you've run out of time, says Dr. Rojas. You've run out of time. I think we... Dr. Rojas. Yes, Eduardo, I think that we have lost Carlos. In any case, I think he was reaching the end of his presentation. We can come back to him later if need be. Very well then. Thank you, Alba. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. We lost your final words, but we did get the thrust of your message. And I see that you people have been doing a great deal to make sure that the recommendation of UNESCO is implemented appropriately. Now I want to give the floor to Alba. Alba is going to be talking to us about the survey that has been carried out so far and what the results of that are. Alba, over to you. Alba, you're muted, Alba. You must unmute yourself. Thank you. Same thing happens to me all the time.
Yes, just to try to encourage people to think a bit more about and come up with some new ideas. What we've done is we've put an online survey up, and the idea is for each connected person to go on to slido.com, as you can see there on the left-hand side of your screen. So you go onto that page, and you'll see in the top part where you can write your name. So you have to write your name up there in that little box. And you have to put HUL3, which is our survey, and you'll have direct access to the questions. So as not to waste any time, we're going to go through these. And then we'll hear your answers and we'll open up a screen so that we can see where people are going with these ideas. So I'm going to go reading through these questions, up to you to write your answers. So I hope that everybody is ready to take this interactive survey. The very first question is, what are your main takeaways from today's presentations and case studies?
What are your main takeaways from today's presentations? You can also answer in English. Tenemos la primera respuesta.
And here we have a very first answer. We have to rethink our management models and the skills needed at the municipal or state level. Let's see if anyone else wants to offer us their main takeaways. Is there anyone else out there who's going to write an answer for us? Oh, here they come. So the very first question. So enhancing multi-stakeholder governance and multi-stakeholder partnerships, contributing with their in-kind resources. because the shared products contribute to each stakeholder's mandate. Someone else is saying that the Caribbean has not been mentioned. Yes, we will get round to that. Community participation and engagement is very important. Involve and offering a human face. I think all of these are very important points. Now we're going to move to the next question. And so the second question is as follows. From your point of view, what are the main challenges in implementing the HUL in Latin America and the Caribbean? So anyone who's got any comments, you can write in Spanish or in English your answer.
So anybody from the Caribbean who wants to bring up the particular issues is more than welcome. Primera respuesta, metodología.
So the first response, I can see consensual methodology, competence, overlapping competence or skills, good governance, funding, management, bringing back inhabitants, getting people to move back into these heritage urban areas, climate change, lack of resources. Very well. Eduardo, I think there are so many different concepts that are important here. Let's move to the third and final question then. So the third and final question, what are the main opportunities in the implementation of HUL in the Latin and Caribbean region?
What are the main opportunities in the implementation of HUL in the Latin America and the Caribbean region? Desarrollo sostenible.
Sustainable development. Rural-urban interface. Exchange, mobility. Empowering communities, community support, decent dwellings, mobility. Again, we've got it in English and in Spanish, so we've got at least two people who are really focused on mobility, community, socialization, involvement of society. So I think maybe now we could move on to our interactive discussion. We've got quite a few ideas that have already come out of there. So thank you very much to all of those who took that poll. Thank you very much, Alba. I think that the answers to this poll really, I think, reflect the complexity and the diversity of issues that we're dealing with. What is clear is that all of these different considerations are built into the concept of the recommendation. And it's the idea that an integral approach, that you've got the physical, the economic, the social, the cultural aspects all pulled in together. And from the participation, from a perspective of the community, participation is so important. And I think all of these concepts were present, not only in the case studies that we saw today, but also in the poll results that we just saw. As we said right at the outset of today's speech, I just wanted to mention three things, if I could. Firstly, it is true in the case of Puebla, where we had both the state view and the municipal view. Remember, there is a lot of convergence, despite the fact that there wasn't actually any coexistence in the different terms of office of those there. But I do think that the way that worked together was very interesting. Also, in the case of Guanajuato, it was really community-based, and there was a huge involvement of the local communities, which is very important in the UNESCO perspective. And also in Valparaiso, we saw a project which really brought in just about all of the ideas in the UNESCO recommendation, how to address a problem which was which really does cut across all of those issues. And the impact that the recommendation is having, I think, can be a little bit more clearly felt now through this. Now, in the poll results, I think it was quite clear that that community participation is so important, and the way that communities are involved. And in the Caribbean, we do have some notable examples that they weren't mentioned here, but there's a long history of national trust for the preservation. And these are private entities that are actually able of defending the interests at stake. And this is one very notable example. And the national trust system, I think, is also very, very involved in the community, because it's private individuals in the community. They could be companies, they could be private individuals, but they do all converge in these national trusts, which means that there is local community involvement. A further consideration is that I just wanted to throw into the discussion. And who pays for all of this? Let's talk about financing. Remember, it's always been a very vertical process. Everyone expects the government to pay. Yes, it's the authorities who have to pay. They pay for everything. And this was always been, because the decisions were made at that level, that's where the funding was. But now we're looking at more public-private cooperation, and there's more joint funding of some initiatives of this nature. And in the case of Valparaiso, there was a hint of this, and there are opportunities so that, for example, developers or firms that are interested in making a profit off the project can actually find a way to get involved, and this works to the benefit of everybody. So now we've got 20 minutes ahead of us so that we can continue this discussion. I'm just going to ask everybody that when you do take the floor, could you speak very briefly, no more than a minute, so that you can, and please stick to the topic that is being discussed. So I'm just looking for raised hands and seeing who can I hand to. Alba, are you able to help me with this? Yes. I think Mr. Sergio Bernara, Secretary of the Government, is asking for the floor. Yes, this is such an interesting discussion. We realized that if we're going to continue with business as usual, when it comes to heritage protection, everybody knows, there are problems with neglect, with lack of upkeep. So I do think that this offers good guidelines when it comes to how to improve the process going forward. And I think that this is, I think the issue of community involvement, those who live in the areas affected, is of vital importance. So we want to help them understand that it's that it's part of their own sustainable development interests to get involved as well. Secondly, the way that the leadership role that can be played by the local authorities is one thing, but also involving the private sector can actually bring a lot of benefits as well. And so I think it's very worthwhile looking into this. And when it comes to the historic center projects, this is where I think, yes, there's going to need to be legislative or regulatory reforms to make sure that there will be more flexibility in the future, so that more can be done to build on the kinds of projects that we've seen presented. Furthermore, when you look at the management plans for these historic centers and World Heritage cities, I think more needs to be done to bring more voices on board in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, the continuity from a regulatory or a legislative point of view is important too. Thank you. Yes? Is there another raised hand? Yes. Mr. Juan Carlos, delegado. Juan Carlos, yes. Thank you very much. Yes, forgive me, we lost just the last few seconds of your presentation a moment ago because the sound cut off. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. Please proceed. Yes, there was a connection problem. But anyway, when we took part in your poll, we were talking about harmonization. And I think this has got to do with the regulatory aspect as well. In the historic town for us, every home seems to be a business. And so this is where some people have like the house or the dwelling in one part and the business part on a different level in the house, and this can actually lead to noise, for example, at night. But when we're talking about excess traffic or noise pollution in the historic center, when we're trying to, trying to strike a balance, this is actually something very difficult for the community. But and it's important to strike that balance in the historic center. So we've been working with the management unit of Guanajuato to try to handle these regulatory issues, particularly by asking the management unit to focus on focusing on the different utilization made of these spaces, or the people that are considering no longer using their dwellings. We're trying to reframe the question and trying to come up with the regulations so that there'll be clearer guidelines as to noise, permissible noise levels, and the hours in which noise can be made, etc. And so we've got to actually do this, and to ensure community participation, we did this through surveys, and we did it through homemakers, through school children, through all kinds of community levels. So honestly, I think regulatory issues are very important. Yes, I think this is very, very important, particularly when in certain parts of a city, if there's a recreational or touristy parts of where this can become a bit of a problem. And so it really is about striking a balance, and there's different utilizations that are made of those spaces in a neighborhood.
Regulations are of the essence here. Obviously, municipalities have a tremendous responsibility to bear when licensing bars, licensing restaurants, hotels, whatever. The way this type of business is distributed in the historic center is extremely important. There's perhaps too much business in some historic centers and not enough in others. Alba? Anybody else? Because unfortunately, I cannot see the people asking for the floor. Not all of them. Yes, there's one person in the survey who put a question on the Caribbean. I don't know whether Eduardo has anything to say, an experience to share with us pertaining to the Caribbean specifically. Well, I did mention a private initiative, the National Trust Conservation. It's a very old tradition in English-speaking countries of tremendous interest. Secondly, in many areas in the Caribbean, the heritage is really linked to colonialism, to colonial times. So there's a rather tricky and contradictory perception from the community, because after all, these beautiful monuments that are still to be found in some areas of the Caribbean, in fact, are actually linked with the colonial past. How to make sure that this colonial past, or at least the vestiges of tremendous cultural interest and historic interest of this colonial past, are nonetheless accepted by the present-day population. This is an interesting point, one of contradictory interests, but definitely one that deserves being explored further. Eduardo? Maria Jose has also asked for the floor. Maria Jose. Yes, thank you. There's one subject that was very complex in our project, and UNESCO did tell us about the fact that competences are being broken up, fragmented. Our country is centrally run. There's tremendous amount of centralization in the country. And the idea is, for instance, that all forms of heritage in the country are exactly the same. They all have equal value. However, you cannot apply the same standards to all various forms of heritage throughout the country, regardless of their particular peculiarities and idiosyncrasies. What is essential is to make sure that everything is brought together. Our team has been doing this joining effort, getting everybody around, people who are interested in maintaining the monuments, those who want to reactivate economically the centers of cities. The thing is, there's so many different responsibilities, and people really putting the blame on the doorstep of somebody else. Oh, that was wrong because so-and-so did not do what they had to do, etc. So the thing is to get all these thinking heads together, because these are people and these are institutions and municipalities getting subsidies from the central government. But there is a need for coordination among all of these various municipalities and institutions and stakeholders. Collective work, which is not just making sure that a particular building is restored and unleashing the potential of particularly from a touristic viewpoint of historic centers. This is why you want to have a management plan. You want to make sure that if a building is private, for instance, it is nonetheless sustainable. For us as a municipality, it isn't, because we don't rent it out at market prices, but at fair prices, you see. But for a private person, it would be tremendously profitable, because the subsidy actually pays for the building practically, and he doesn't even have to wait until he gets somebody moving in and paying rent. Well, thank you very much for what you're saying, because you're talking about the tremendous fragmentation to be found in so many countries, so many different institutions involved. To put it in another way, so many people have a finger in the pie, and in the end, the pie is tasteless. So what is interesting here is to make sure, in the light of UNESCO's recommendation, that national, regional, local levels be brought together, be harmonized, and also to decentralize and to empower local levels. At the local level, probably the best initiatives can be taken and the best regulations can be enforced, because after all, it is at local level that the local authorities know exactly what the main problems are of the inhabitants of any one particular area. So there is a need for exchange between the various levels. There is a need also for a degree of acceptance. There should be no hierarchy. There should be participation at every single level. And where financing is concerned, obviously, you mentioned what you're doing with the resources coming from a variety of sources. And this is a reality for the whole of Latin America. We need more sophisticated mechanisms than what we have at the present time. At times, for instance, you take forever, let's say 4 years, simply to get enough money in order to get a project off the ground. It's not possible. Everywhere in Latin America, we're up against this coordination problem, this lack of coordination among the various authorities involved. Alba, we still have 7 minutes left. No, 5 minutes, in fact. And then the rapporteur will be summing up for us. So one last question, very short, please, to the point. Thank you. Graciela León, you've been raising your hand for quite some time. Yes, Graciela, please. Over to you. Thank you. We have identified the problems. We all agree what the problems are with the historic centers. But one thing stands out. What are we going to do? And now what? The path to the future. Going forward, what happens? Now, obviously, we have problems with the 3 governmental levels. We need to get them working together. We have problems with the financing, how to get everybody involved along the same guidelines, along the same lines of action. But it's also important to know precisely at what point the investment has to be made. We've been talking about depopulation, but where, in which particular areas, particularly in historic centers where they're huge. For instance, Puebla is a very large historic center. And if we don't have a very clear diagnosis, things become extremely complicated. I'm in charge of urban development and sustainability for Puebla and licensing as well. And the hoteliers themselves, the hotel industry saying, please don't give any licenses for any future hotels. We already have too many hotels. And yet, again, you need to have tourism. You need to reactivate and vivify tourism in all of these areas. But if we don't mitigate, if we don't have the precise diagnosis where we need really to focus, where we need to bring our attention to, we won't be able to get it off the ground at all. Thank you. Thank you, Graciela. I think that you hit the nail on the head, talking about complication and intricate things. And that particular nail is item 3 in the UNESCO recommendation for historic urban landscapes. How do we evaluate and assess vulnerability and resistance to change in several areas? It's very important because our approach has always been, that is the way things look like now. This is the way it should look like ideally. So how do we go from point A to point B? However, going from point A to point B involves a number of changes, and each particular change is tricky because you want to be able to sustain the cultural identity of the historic center, whatever the changes that are necessary to go from point A to point B. Because if you change things without really knowing where you're heading for, you might imperil the historic identity of that area. So rehabilitation has to take into account that transition and the difficulty in carrying out these changes. I'm just launching the idea to initiate or to elicit some thinking about this. Thank you very much, Alba, for what you've been doing. Alba, over to you now. Fine. Thank you. Our rapporteur will now take over. She will be giving us the conclusions and to provide a visual aid for her presentation. We will show you something now, showing in summary fashion the various points that have been discussed today.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Jordi, for organizing this very interesting colloquium on HUL and historical cities in Latin America and the Caribbean region. And the discussion has been so rich. It's actually really hard to summarize it, but what I did wanted to try to focus on in my summary here was look at some of the objectives, innovation and renovation over the last years of HUL sites in historic cities. And also what also stood out was the way that this recommendation is not only directed towards World Heritage sites, but to any city that wants to use it as guidelines. Also, what came out today, it feels that this recommendation has had more impact in World Heritage cities. And so the question now would be, how can this actually have a spillover effect and reach out to other cities that might not actually be inscribed on the list? Moreover, I just wanted to mention this change that was undertaken in these. It's not only as concerns their official but also the wider setting. There was also mention of such important aspects of the recommendations, such as, for example, the changing usages made of World Heritage cities, the different strata, like the social aspects, the natural aspects, environmental aspects, and having a more holistic approach to deal with that. Another important point that was raised was that what the recommendation does is attempt to reconcile the development, the urban development, with cultural heritage. And this is a huge challenge when it comes to the safeguarding of heritage in the urban setting. And in this regard, the recommendation actually opens possibilities for working together in a cross-cutting approach to bring about that change and manage that change. We also saw some very interesting case studies from World Heritage cities, but I think we saw this on the broader territorial scale, and also in Puebla, for example, we saw two different levels of administration. And in Puebla, we were able to assess the neighborhood level work, the grassroots work, and also in Guanajuato, we were able to look at how the management unit was created, or in Valparaiso, it was more about the use of a specific building. So we had different levels, different scales at which the recommendation can actually be beneficial if it's implemented. And I think it highlights the need of working at different technical levels on World Heritage. There were so many other very valid and important points that were made. One topic that struck me in Latin America is that we can see, as listed among the challenges or issues, was the depopulation of historic centers and the deterioration, not only of in the physical sense, but also of the social fabric in these historic centers. And we saw some examples of how attempts were being made to approach this issue of deterioration. And I think there are a lot of lessons learned, but I particularly wanted to highlight the last comments that were made by our colleagues from the cities themselves. But last, yes, here it is, the issue of legislation. I think that this is actually a really important point because I think often in Latin America, when we see these problems concerning the legislative changes, I'm not sure if this happens at every level, but it would have been interesting as well to have had an example from the Caribbean, and I take that comment on point. But also with the change of governments, it doesn't always actually enable continued management, continuous management. And we were able to see an example of the different management levels with Puebla. and also the balance between different utilizations. As we saw often in Latin American cities, and Mexico might be an example, maybe Argentina as well, but we do see a trend in other places to have a top-down approach with our legislation and regulations, and it might be time for a more localized approach. And finally, just wanted to underscore what was mentioned about the need for clear diagnostics, understanding what is required, what needs to be done. And there were some other notes that I took down that I also thought were a bit about, I think, funding. Yes, financing was an issue that came up again and again in today's discussion. We saw the example in Valparaiso, where it was necessary to have shared funding and open that cooperation with the private sector, and not only go thinking that conservation is the responsibility of the government and that's the end of story. It cannot be all in the hands of the government. Other aspects? Well, I don't think we actually had a lot of time to discuss the impact of the pandemic and the way forward, or climate change. I think those two issues kind of were a bit left to the sidelines. Perhaps we didn't have enough time. But also, I think this shows the importance of science in all of this, both in terms of climate change and of the pandemic. And among all of these issues that were discussed here today is probably valid for other historic centers as well, is the importance of resilience of the local communities, for example, and the importance of giving the community the tools so that they can really take ownership or appropriation of their heritage in their districts and know how to manage it themselves. I think this is really important, and this harks back to what Eduardo was saying right at the outset, which is we've got to work a little bit more, not only from top down, but also work from bottom up, working hand in hand, and seeing that we're not actually in opposing positions, but this is going to require coordination, not only intersectoral coordination, but also coordination among the different levels of government and with the local communities. And one example of this that came out was the National Trust in the Caribbean that Eduardo was mentioning. And this could be a model from which Latin America could actually learn. If we're going to create these kinds of spaces in which the local populations feel involved, that they can have an active role in preserving their historic centers. It's also very important to underscore the importance of buffer zones. This was particularly crucial in HULs. How are those managed? How are those defined? This is a challenge not only for historic cities, but for all World Heritage areas, and be they HUL sites or other protected areas. The buffer zone, the issue of buffer zones, I think, needs further discussion. And in particular, when it comes to cities, we've got to see how can we address the buffer zones. And another one was the system of values, because I think everybody talked about values as if the World Heritage had actually written into stone what these were. But remember that the recommendation also proposes looking beyond the values that it might have been recognized with inscription on the World Heritage list. And this again is an issue that needs to be addressed with historic cities, because if you want to be able to manage change, it's important not to see those recognized OUV elements as being inscribed in stone and never changing. And it's important to see how they can be changed over time, and how the cities and the landscapes will change over time. So I think those were some of the key areas that we discussed today. Thank you. Wow, I think you've done an amazing job summarizing that. Thank you very, very much for that, Maya. And thank you for all of those very valid comments. I think this is going to lead us to the end of our session because we've run out of time. And I think it's a pity that we didn't have more time to discuss everything as much as we would like to. But to anyone who is interested, the discussion is going to continue on the 24th of June in the session in which all of these issues that have been discussed in today's panel are going to be further discussed. We're going to hear more about the Latin American Caribbean region through other experts. We're going to have other site managers. For example, we'll be having with us again the state government of Puebla. And so I'd like to encourage you all to reconnect on the 24th so that you can see this. And this will hopefully be able to give you even more insights as to how the HUL recommendation is being rolled out. So thank you again very, very much. And I don't know, Eduardo, if you wanted to make a few closing remarks. Thank you. I wanted to thank everybody for their participation today and to thank you for this most interesting discussion that we've had. I think that this 10th anniversary has shown just how important the theory and the practical concerning historic and urban landscapes are. When they work together, you can achieve great results. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I hope to see you in the upcoming sessions. And if you're interested, you can join in and connect and learn about other areas in the world on the 24th. So then we hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Adiós. Saludos a todos. Felicidades.
Gracias.
Gracias, Maya, por las...
Saludos.
Los esperamos en Guanajuato. Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Recording stopped.